Hello, look who's early today. How are you today? Hey, Vince. You doing good today?
Was kind of turned off because there's some special assessments.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and you can't rent out anything up there, which is fine. It would just be for her.
Okay.
And it did not include the parking, the
Oh,
garage parking, and that was at a separate cost. And
uh-huh.
she just was a little bit turned off with the special assessments that are coming up.
Mhm.
So she's
Oh,
still
yeah.
looking.
Well, those assessments can be daunting when some of them are quite heavy, but at the same token, when you stop and think about, you want to protect your investment. So I guess they're a good thing, but they don't feel good when you're having to pay this large sum of money to make sure that the property is maintained. But special assessments can be a real booger. In fact, we'll talk about those a little bit today as we go through our offer to purchase. But um, the special assessments that are on the property right now would have to be paid by the seller.
Okay. But
Um,
anything upcoming would have to be
by the buyer.
buyer. Okay.
Now, but we'd make sure that if it's in South Carolina, North Carolina, though. If this is this at the coast or is this here?
It's here. It's North Carolina.
Okay, if it's North Carolina, then the special assessments are paid by the seller at closing.
Okay.
So, which might be a selling point
Yeah.
because if something has been taken care of to maintain the property to protect the investment, then the seller would be responsible for paying it. And of course, she would have anything going forward, but hopefully, hopefully there wouldn't be anything going forward anytime soon anyway. So, but
Yes.
yeah, kind of look into that and see if
Thank
see what
you.
spatial assessment. Maybe that'll help a little bit.
Thank you
Now,
so much.
you're welcome, honey. In South Carolina, it's a little different. In South Carolina, it is not spelled out as distinctly as we just said. It's not spelled out that the seller pays. There is an option who pays in the South Carolina contract. So if you're doing that South Carolina contract, make sure that you don't get confused with the North Carolina and uh, and forget to check, which one needs to be paying.
Thank
Okay,
you. Thank you so
you're
much.
welcome. We had one of our agents got stuck on that a couple of weeks ago, and she said, "But I thought the seller had to pay." And I said, "Honey, look at that paragraph. There's two boxes: check by buyer or seller," and it looked like the buyer obviously checked for the seller to pay it, and it really really threw him for a loop. But anyway, just to be aware of it. Hey, Alex, good to have you today. You got your mute on, but I can say hey to you anyway. All right, let's see. And that's Mr. J. Tucker. Let's see if we can get some forms up and we'll get started today. I'm so glad y'all are with me. Now, hang in there and I'll try not to lose you now that you're here, okay? All right, we're going to share our screen and then we're going to go to our North Carolina buyer forms. Oh, and before I forget it, now we will not, I won't have sessions, these Thursday sessions for the next 2 weeks. The rest of the December, gonna take some time off because I know you all have got as much as you can handle too. And of course, there would be the South Carolina forums, but just to remind you, we won't have our Thursday afternoon session, but we'll start again in January and get back on it. But in the meantime, hopefully we can still do email or phone calls if you need me. Okay. We want to start as we do with everything. You got to start with the work of the real estate agent's disclosure. The disclosure form is the simplified version of what we used to use that was in the form of a brochure. It was the Working Real Estate Agents brochure. And now that brochure is actually turned into a Q&A. It's a lot more cumbersome. You may want to have some copies of that brochure. I was talking to an agent yesterday, and she's having trouble getting some people to sign the disclosure form. And I said, well, it may mean that they need more information than they have here. Or it could be just they're paranoid about signing anything, because, even though we're saying this is not a contract, signing it only means you have received it, they're still apprehensive and they don't necessarily trust that. So sometimes it's just people are reluctant to sign anything at first. So if they were to need more information, those brochures are quite informative. And they're, like I said, they're written in the form of a question and an answer. So you can get those at the Realtor store down at Canopy, or I should say uptown at Canopy, or you can order them online at ncrec.gov, the North Carolina Real Estate Commission.gov. And there's no cost to shipping or no shipping, no tax. They're just 25 cents a piece. So if you want to have some of those on hand, it wouldn't be a bad idea. If you don't need the extra or don't want to use them, you obviously got the simplified version. The disclosure form is in your forms on your DocuSign or .loop or zip forms. And sometimes you might even have some of these printed out. If you have them printed out, basically it's buyers on one side and sellers on one side or the other side. So that gives a full explanation to the person that you're talking with. Also, I want to remind you that you're probably not going to have a full file on everyone that you get to sign this disclosure form. So I would suggest that you either have a manila folder somewhere where you can store any and all disclosure forms in, so that we could get to it if we needed to, or you can start an opportunity that's just simply for any and all Working Real Estate Agents disclosures. The Real Estate Commission, when they come in and do an unexpected audit and surprise you, the first question they ask is, where are the Working with Real Estate Agents disclosures? Because they know that you don't have a file for every one of them. And so they start questioning me where the ones are that didn't work out. And as a way to ensure that you all do give them to any and everybody you talk to, that you have found out their motivation, they often will check us on that. So I would suggest at the very least, you have a manila folder that if I call you, you can give me a folder, okay? If you don't want to put them in the opportunity and command. The most important thing that you want to start out with, of course, is the fact that this form is not a contract. You want to make sure that you stress that to them. This is simply a way that you can explain to to the people the way realtors work. Realtors in different states work in different ways. There's some terms that are generic to cross the state lines, but by and large, they might be written differently in the state forms. One of our agents just posed a question for me today, and I had to do a little research on it. North Carolina does obviously practice single agency, which we would be representing one agent representing one client, buyer or seller, or we have dual agency. We also have designated agency, but both of those terms involve the firm. And it's hard for people sometimes in other states to understand that when they sign an agency agreement, it's with the firm, it's not with you as an individual agent. you are representing the firm in this situation. So every now and then, it's hard for, particularly if they've done business in other states, for them to quite grasp how we're doing it here in North Carolina. And it's would probably be no different if you went to New York and tried to do it up there, okay? Um, so when you're filling out this form with a potential client, as soon as they start talking about their motivation, that's their substantial contact. You have to present your first substantial contact. When you start talking about motivation, when you start talking about their wants and their needs and their, particularly their financing, you just put your little hand up like that and say, wait, 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 wait. I got to talk to you about something first. Just be that abrupt. Just say, got to talk to you about something. I need to go over this disclosure form, because this is a law in North Carolina that we must talk to people about how real estate agents work with them before we proceed any further. I have never had anybody say, what do you mean? They don't do that. You've caught them off guard by your abrupt, wait a minute, I got to take care of the legal stuff first. And it sets the tone of how you and that client or that person are going to work together. You have basically taken control of the conversation at that point, all right? And so you become the leader, and that's what you want to be. You're not the dictator, but you are the leader in the relationship. So you take it over and you make sure that you explain to the buyer or the seller. Today we're talking about buyers. You want to make sure that you explain, not thoroughly, just briefly here. We will thoroughly explain it when we go into the agency agreement, okay? But right now, we just want to make sure that they understand that we can represent them. We can represent them exclusively. We can actually, in North Carolina, you can begin on an oral agreement. I don't advise it. Seen too many agents get burned by doing an oral agreement. However, North Carolina allows you to work with an agent, with a client who said, well, I'm not ready to sign an agency agreement, but you still have to disclose it with them, how we work, okay? But then you don't ever, ever, ever write an offer until you do have it in writing. You can start out with it, like a little agreement orally, but you don't ever go any beyond that. Now, the dual agency here, all you're going to disclose is that the firm can represent this client, this person, on both sides, or if we designate someone else in our firm, that's called designated agency, so that you, as the one talking to them, could represent them entirely, and we would designate someone else. But both of these have to involve the firm, whereas this is going to be just you working with that buyer. Scoots down here, an unrepresented buyer. Every now and then, we're going to have a buyer who decides that they can handle it themselves. The agent would not represent the seller, or the agent might, if they're a listing agent, then they would represent the seller. But the main thing to help a buyer understand is, just because they say they're going to be unrepresented and they talk to a listing agent or a seller, that doesn't mean that that agent or that seller is going to give them the break on the commission. Most of the time when someone wants to be unrepresented, it's simply about money. And they think if they go to the seller directly or go to the listing agent directly, that agent is going to give the buyer the 3% or 2.5%, whatever the buyer's agent commission would have been. But legally, that's not what happens. That's not to say that it can't be negotiated that way, but that's not the way that agreements are written. So just help that buyer to understand it may or may not be to his advantage financially, but you can certainly guarantee him that he'll have a better experience if he has representation, especially by you. You get the buyer to sign here. You're going to put your name down here, and come on down. For some reason, there it is. You want to put your agent license number. Your agent license number is very important on many of the documents that you're going to have in North Carolina. You're going to be asked for your signature and your license number. On this one, it really isn't your signature. It could be just your printed name. Now, the exclusive buyer's agency agreement. This is what we prefer, obviously. The exclusive buyer agency agreement means that if that buyer buys a house, you're going to get paid. It means that you're going to represent that buyer and you're going to earn your pay. But every now and then you might get a buyer who says, I can handle it. I don't mind signing that agreement. You get paid, but I don't need you to help me. That's a really awkward feeling, but every now and then you'll get that. You might even have the buyer who says, well, I'm going to buy 3 or 4 properties and I want to work with different agents. Isn't there some way that you can just work with me on one property? Yes, there is. That's not the way we prefer to do it. That would be a non-exclusive buyer agency. There is a non-exclusive buyer agency in our forms. And like I said, if it's an investor who's going to buy several properties, sometimes that's the way they would prefer to work with you. But by and large, the agreement that you're going to work on is this exclusive buyer agency agreement. Whereas even if the seller were to try to sell to your buyer, if your buyer buys, you would be entitled to be paid on it. Okay, so let me show you the number of the form is 201. You want to go down here on the right hand side of the form. You see 201 down here, and you see it's copyrighted in 7/2021. That's the current form. And those of you who are assisting some agents, you make sure that they are using the correct form. I don't want to see any of these 2019 forms in here like I've seen recently. Sometimes when you have some templates set up, or you might have some folders set up where you have put the forms that agents use or you as the agent use, and you forget to change them. When the forms change in July, then you're going to wind up getting some out-of-date agency agreements. And if it went to court, it could be thrown out for that very reason. So you want to make sure to take care of your client and take care of your agents with making sure the templates or the folders that include the forms actually have the current forms. I did not put it in this stack, but we've gone over this before. The multicolored checklist that I have for you, you can go into your kwbresources.com, kwbresources.com, and look under Office Resources, and you'll under that heading on the banner, you'll see that you can get some checklists. If you don't have the checklist, I would highly recommend that you keep a paper copy where you can check it from time to time to make sure you not only have the correct form number, you have the correct date on that form number, okay? Now, when you pull out this form, this is the form where you're going to be more detailed. You gave a very simplified version in the disclosure. This is a contract. It is legally binding. So you will want to make sure that you thoroughly explain this to the buyer. Again, the buyer's name should go here. The firm name goes here, not the agent's name. The firm names goes here. So it would be Keller Williams Realty or Keller Williams Valentine area. This kind of gives a little explanation as to that it's with the firm. Then you want to come down here. If there is an entity, anytime you see that blue box or the red box for sure, the blue box is for you to take note. If you are working with someone who says they are buying this for an entity, such as an LLC or a corporation or a trust even, then you need to find out if they have some documentation that says they have the right to obligate that entity to purchase this property or to purchase a property. If it's an LLC, it'll be the manager of the LLC. If it's a corporation, if they are going to have a named person who is designated and authorized to sign, and there will be something in writing that they can give to you. You definitely want to get that before you write an offer to purchase. This buyer's agency agreement, I would prefer to have at this point, but by and large, the more important time is no later than when you write the offer, because you're going to have to provide that to the attorney. Now, this right here, I tell you what, if I could highlight that in the brightest yellow I could find, I would be doing so. That little paragraph right there causes so much grief. What you want to do is to ask that person if they have signed a buyer's agency agreement with anybody else. If they've signed it with another firm, another agent, then you can't sign them up. You cannot put their name on here. If you sign them up with this document, you have obligated them to 2 commissions. If they have an exclusive agency agreement with another firm, then very likely that firm could legally go after them for the commission. Well, if we're working with them and we have an agreement, don't you think you want to get paid? Sure you do. So this little form right here, and I know that looks really innocent, but it says the buyer represents as the commencement date of this agreement. The buyer is not a party to a buyer representation agreement with any other real estate firm. Underline it, highlight it, whatever. And you know what? Sometimes buyers honestly don't know. Other times they do. But sometimes they'll give you this real innocent look and you'll say, do you have you signed any of the paperwork? No, we haven't. And then they'll say, well, we were working with someone a few months ago and we put in a couple of offers, but they didn't work well for us. And so we don't want to go back to them. A red light should have just gone on in your head. If they wrote a couple of offers, that means they would have had a buyer's agency agreement with them, right? Because you can't write an offer until you have the buyer agency agreement. So at that point, you explain to them that we need to make sure, or Mr. Prospective buyer, you need to make sure that that contract is no longer in force. And they can go back to the broker in charge or go back to that agent that they worked with and make sure that their buyer agency agreement is not still in effect. If it was several months ago, it could have expired by now. If it is still in effect, what they would do is talk to the broker in charge of that firm and ask for a termination of that buyer's agent. You cannot give them a form. You cannot give them any direction or any counsel other than to say, until you settle that with the broker in charge of that firm, we can't move forward because I'm not going to obligate you to 2 commissions. And they kind of like that. Obviously, they don't want to have to go back and settle anything, but they don't want to be obligated to 2 commissions either. So be real cautious when you're talking about this paragraph right here. And sometimes people think when they do the buyer agency agreement and an offer to purchase at the same time, they think when the offer isn't accepted, that the buyer's agency agreement goes away too. That's what I'm saying. They're innocent sometimes. They don't understand that buyer's agency agreement can go across 6 months or whatever, how many months, and you could have multiple offers maybe offered and not accepted, but the buyer's agency agreement continues on. And that's where sometimes they are truly innocent. They don't understand that. So you camp out on that paragraph until you get some understanding with that buyer. Now, when you come down here to provision 1 for the type of property, it would be very unusual that you're going to have any property other than residential. Our residential agents don't sell commercial and vice versa. So this is a residential form. So you're most likely going to be just having residential here. The general location, keep in mind the word general. Do not be specific in this area. If they're looking in Mecklenburg County, but they have said, well, you know what, we'd be willing to go into Union or Cabarrus County to find the right house, might even go into South Carolina. If you are licensed in South Carolina, you would write this: Mecklenburg and surrounding counties, including York and Lancaster, South Carolina counties. If you're licensed there. If you're not, just leave that little portion off. Just put Mecklenburg and surrounding counties. That will cover you if you do go into some of these other counties. See, our MLS covers like 18 or 20 counties. So you could find information you could sell in lots of counties. You do not want to limit yourself just to where they start on this form. All right. Now, having said that, occasionally you're going to find someone who says, I'm only going to sign this form for one property. So they give you the name of that, the address of that one property. You can do the agreement, but with the understanding that it only applies to that one house. Okay. So otherwise, I would never put anything specific. We have had people, unfortunately, lose out on commission when they put, the one that comes to my mind now is the girl had put, agent had put South Charlotte, Pineville, and Matthews. And the buyer went up, bought a house in Statesville, totally, and didn't buy it obviously with her, bought it through another agent. And we didn't have a ground to stand on because this agreement only applied to South Charlotte, Pineville, and Matthews. Okay. So all that to say, be specific only if it's a specific property. All right. Any agreement has to have a beginning date and an end date. In this particular agreement, they have added an option on the end date. It's going to begin most likely the day you sign the agreements. All right. It will begin on that date. Now, if your buyer or the buyer is going to purchase one property, which most of your buyers would be purchasing one, you're going to check this box right here, and then you're going to go down here and give yourself 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, 6 hours these days. You don't need too much with all these multiple offers, do you? So give yourself time to get enough multiple offers in there to win one of them. Now, the second option here, this would be, and it would take care of that investor who's going to be buying multiple properties, but they just don't want to sign this buyer's agent's agreement every time they make an offer on a property. So you then can have an exclusive relationship with that investor, but you would only have one buyer agency agreement rather than the non-exclusive one that I mentioned earlier. So if this is for someone buying more than one property, and I would put here that end date, I'd go at about 2 years, or minimum a year. It is not auto-renewable. So you have to have that end date. And if you're going to work with someone on multiple properties, like a 1031 tax-free exchange, you might have several properties with one client with the 1031 exchange. So give yourself enough time to find those properties and to get them closed. Okay. Now come down here on the compensation for the firm. Remember, the compensation is paid to the firm on the CD when you go to closing, is paid to the firm, and then the arrangement of your splits or your commission is with the firm. So the commission is paid out of closing to the firm, and then Lynn Davis, our MCA, obviously processes the closing, and then you're paid out of that. This blank right here, put in a there. We do not engage in business with non-refundable retainer fees. It's just not acceptable in our marketplace, and we just really don't do retainers. There's too much confusion on them, and so we don't do them. The next one is the amount of money that you're going to expect out of the transaction that you're going to do for this buyer. For years, we have done 3%, but you and I both know, if you've been in the business several weeks or months now, that we're seeing a lot of change in the buyer's agency commission. You can put 3% there because that's by and large what we would anticipate and would respectfully ask for. If 2.5% or 2% is offered in MLS, we do not go back to the buyer and say you must pay the difference in that 3% and 2. That has not been our practice. However, as we have faced the change in the buyer agent's commission that has been so drastic, we are rethinking some scripts and some ways that we can help the buyer to understand that if there is only like a $1,500 commission offered, one of the builders is offering a $1,500 no matter what the price of the house is. That's only one builder, and that's not the norm yet, although the norm is coming down. But let's just say you are going to sell a $565,000 home and you're going to get $1,500. In that situation, I think I would go back and talk with that buyer and explain to them that there are times that the seller does not offer the money. And obviously we're selling real estate to make a living. We're not in it as a hobby. And so in order to have the income that we need to have in our own business endeavors, we would need to come back and ask the buyer. If they choose that particular builder and that particular home, we will certainly work with them, but we would have to come back to them and ask them for a difference. So, and that's going to be a hard conversation until you get confident with it, until you feel that you do have value and you are bringing value to the transaction, and it's not just what a seller's willing to pay you. You have value to that buyer, and it may come in the near future that the sellers will not pay any compensation to a buyer's agent. So not to scare you, just to let you know, that's kind of where the market is headed right now. So although we will seek to get our compensation out of MLS, there may be times that we would have to come back to the buyer. Then you want to make sure that in this section here, every now and then, you can go and not only ask the buyer, you can go back and ask the firm. Now, I'm going to tell you, the builder's not going to do anything different, but every now and then, an agent with another firm will work with you on the commission. And remember, when the seller signs the listing agreement, that's when the agreement is documented as to how much is going to be paid to a buyer's agent. So the buyer agent, obviously, the listing agent would have to go back and talk with the seller. But if the buyer agent said, would you please respectfully consider paying me 2.5% rather than 1.5%, that can be done. And if you want to do that, it's form 220. So you might want to make a note over to the left on this form, or there would be form 220 if you are going to request the firm or the listing agent to make up a difference in what's offered in the MLS. This one is when you don't see that much right now, but in a balanced market, every now and then, to incentivize the transaction, a seller will offer a bonus. Builders have offered bonuses for years. There is a form called, it's 770. 770 must be filled out between you and your client. It has nothing to do with anybody else. We are, as agents, are required to disclose to a buyer if we're going to get compensated in addition to whatever amount is up here. Let's say we took this at 2%, heaven forbid. But anyway, if we put a ticket at 2%, but this particular seller is offering $1,000 if it's closed before the end of the year. So if that's the case, that would be an MLS. So you would have to go to Form 770, take it to your buyer and say, the seller is offering me a $1,000 bonus if we close this by the end of the year. It's just a simple statement. You're not asking for permission. You are basically disclosing to them what is in MLS that's offered to the agent. All right. And then you get them to sign that you disclose it to them. This form is 220 here. This form will be 770. And it's noted actually in the next page. You'll see where it notes the 770. Okay. A couple of points on that. When you sell a new construction, it's not unusual that they have some incentive. It's not as often right now, but you will in short time probably see some more incentives in there. And if there is like a percentage offered, or let's say that same $1,000, I developed a confident reply to that many years ago because it became my business decision. And that's exactly how I explained to the buyer that years ago, I made a business decision that any time that I had a bonus or any extra incentive, that I would split it with my buyer. And I have never had one to argue with me over that. I think it has to do with the fact they realize I did make that decision, and that is what I'm going to do, and that's all I'm going to do. I hear agents a lot of times here, buyers they say, well, why do you get incentives? Why don't I get it? Because it's an agent bonus, first of all. So you take the leadership, you're guiding this, and you explain to them that this is your decision and you're going to give them half. So they don't have to come back and ask you for whole. All right. Hopefully you'll have a chance to practice that script in the near future when we maybe get some incentives, which we don't have right now. All right, let's scoot on down here. You might want to make sure that you understand and you know what the firm's duties are. You want to make sure, wait a minute, I went too far. You want to make sure that you know the firm's duties. You don't have to itemize all those, but point out a couple of things that we do. Obviously, it's written in detail here. The disclosure of the buyer's name and mailing address. You obviously have to disclose that unless they tell you you can't. And this is where it's actually written out for them to understand that. Now, this is something that we have to deal with this year. This is kind of new. It is not new that we have had fair housing laws, and we as realtors have been abiding by those fair housing laws for a long time. This past year, it's become more pronounced that we may be in violation of some of those, not intentionally, even using some words that could be offensive to someone. So we have had a renewed emphasis on fair housing, and you must explain that to the buyers. So you are obligated to the laws of the land, obviously, and it's your commitment through your code of ethics to take care of all those protected categories. Now, the thing that has really been brought to the forefront is the buyer's letters to the seller. There was an article published out of the National Association of Realtors not too long ago. It said, love letters are liability. These love letters have become a source of violation of fair housing laws. One of the purposes of the letters is to relate to that seller. So the buyer is going to be writing things that would cause that seller to favor them. And by giving them reason to favor them, many times they are making statements that would be in violation. And again, sometimes it's simple. you don't think that using the word children would be a violation. It is. You can't even use, this would be the perfect yard for my children and their play sets, and I can just see them now playing football in the backyard. So you can't even say that. You can't say, I would love to be close to the Charlotte Latin or whatever, or you know, the Jewish Community Center. See, that's a violation. And so, having said that, you have a little explanation and you say, so Mr. Buyer, I'm going to represent you in every way and I'm going to take care of you. And the way I'm going to take care of you is I will not be party to conveying a love letter from you to the seller. So you just said it right up front. However they want to relate to the seller, beyond that, you may not be able to control, but you are not going to be the one who passes love letters to the seller. Okay. All right. Now, when you come on down here, again, you're going to have some itemized things of the buyer's duties. You want to make sure you have those sample copies, the sample of the offer to purchase and the sample of the professional services disclosure, and the questions and answers on home inspections. Make sure that you have those for the buyer. I would hope that you might even have a packet of things ready to give to them and hand to them, or at least that you can send to them digitally. The home warranty, we do not charge a fee for the home warranty. If we set the home warranty up, there is no fee given to us by the home warranty company. So you're going to put an NA right there. The next paragraph that you want to take a look at is the confidentiality of offers. This also is something that's been prominent this year in our discussions, because you've heard the term escalation clause, or maybe you haven't heard it, but you will hear it. Escalation clause is a practice that has come into North Carolina from some northern states where they do practice it and it's legal in their state. We have been highly advised by the attorneys who write our forms, but also that represent the commission, not to use escalation clauses. Having said that, there is one firm in our local area who persists on using them. I think they are cooling off their jets a little bit now, but while it's not totally against the law, it is highly suspect of a problem because of this paragraph right here. In an escalation clause, an attorney would have to draft it. And if the attorney drafts it, it would say something to the fact that that buyer is willing to pay $3,000 more than the highest offer of any other of the multiple offers that the seller receives. And what happens is, if the seller is willing to take that, then the seller has, let's say, 17 other offers. Then the buyer would have a right to ask to see the highest one of those 17 offers, of which he's going to pay $3,000 more. The seller cannot show them that. That is a confidential matter, unless the party making the offer, the other buyer, gives permission. Now tell me why a buyer would give permission to show his offer if he knows that's going to knock him out of the position of having a chance to get the house. So you don't get it. So anyway, this is the black and white of why we don't do escalation clauses. Now, the next few paragraphs, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, because we've talked a lot about agency in past times. And by and large, this is your full explanation of dual agency. This is where you camp out and spend some time if you're talking to your buyer. Now, what I want to point out to you is this pattern right here. See, there's 4 blanks here. You are to initial only one. So we would prefer that the buyer allow us to be a dual agent as a firm. And as a firm, we can designate you with a sign right here to represent only that buyer, and we would designate someone else to represent the seller. More times than not, this happens when you, as the buyer, show a Valentine listing. So it's automatic at that particular time that you are designated to represent the buyer. And the listing agent is already designated to represent the seller. So in that way, they have exclusive representation with you. But in order to have exclusive representation, the firm has to be the dual agent. All right. Now this option right here, again, the wording is misleading because it looks like if the buyer wants exclusive representation at all times, that's what most buyers want when they sign this. It looks like they should choose that. But if they choose that, they're going to eliminate all the listings of Keller Williams Valentine. And we typically run around 400 listings. We don't have now because nobody has them, but we always have a lot of listings. And you don't want to eliminate those listings. So you want to help them to understand it's to their advantage, and they will have exclusive representation because you're going to allow them to initial right here. So it's one set of these. If they check this, this is no longer an option. If they initial here, then they have this option. Okay. Now let's go on down to the next page. The dual agency compensation, that is when if you were to be an individual dual agent, there would be a 6% commission or whatever's agreed on the agency agreements. And that's just so that the buyer understands that. The buyer should consult with the firm before visiting any resale or new homes or contacting any other real estate firm representing sellers to avoid the possibility of confusion over the brokerage relationship, misunderstandings about liability for compensation. That's kind of what we were talking about early on, right? When we're about that general location, remember that buyer who went up to Statesville and bought a house? Obviously, they didn't abide by this right here. Anytime the buyer goes to an open house or they get to a builder, by the way, if you think they're going to go to builders on their own, make sure you give them a stack of your cards so they can take a card with them. Or if you know which builder they're going to, you call and register with the builder so that the builder knows that you are involved in all this. Builders could care less about the buyer's agency agreement. They want to know who's registering that buyer. All right, so you make sure that you help the buyer to understand that all communications with any other seller, whether it's a resale or a builder, whoever, should come through you or with you. I'm not going to spend too much time on that right now. We need to scoot on to the offer. Wire fraud warning. The wire fraud warning in red is in the buyer agency agreement. It's in the listing agreement, and it's in the offer to purchase. So you think the writers want you to explain it and draw attention to it? You're mighty right they do, because we're seeing billions of dollars leave our country out of wire fraud. I mean, it's a syndicated big business, and so we have to fight crime by making people knowledgeable, not to trust email and don't trust facts. It has to be verbal to verbal conversation with someone that they know and respect. And one thing I would want to warn you is if you get an encrypted email from an attorney giving you the CD, do not forward that email. It loses its encryption as soon as you hit that button to send. It's encrypted from the sender to you. It does not go when it's forwarded. Take that in. Don't forget that. We've had one agent lose $5,000 because she didn't pay attention. Make sure that the attorneys, and almost all the attorneys now, are sending in encrypted CDs. All right. Now, coming on down here, I want you to make sure that you do put the information on the buyer. I would prefer that you would put the buyer's name, their at least one phone number, preferably their cell number, their email, and a mailing address. I hope we won't need it, but every now and then we do for legal reasons. And I need to be able to get in touch with them. If I can't get in touch with you, or maybe you don't have the information, make sure on the buyer agency agreement, you put their information. Do not put their information on the offer to purchase, because you do not want the other agent or the seller to have your buyer's information. You do not put that on and I'll point that out to you in a moment. But on the agency agreement, I do want as much information as you can gather to put on that. And again, if it is an entity buyer, such as the LLC or trustee or what trust fund, a trustee of a trust, make sure you put the name here. And here is going to be a signature of the entity that's authorized to sign. Here's a title of that person and their information here. And then here is your signature and your license number. The firm in North Carolina, the North Carolina firm license number is capital C 13291. 13291. In South Carolina, if you want to make a note, it's 10902. Sometimes I see 350 in there because y'all have learned that's the market center number is 350. Okay, the offer to purchase. Hopefully, we're not doing this all at the same time, but we very well may be with the way the market is going so fast right now. When you're doing your offer to purchase, obviously the offer has to be filled out in its entirety with any addenda that's necessary. And if at all possible, make sure that you get the residential property disclosure, the mineral oil and gas mandatory disclosure, lead-based if necessary. If you can get CCRs before your buyer makes his offer, that is very beneficial. LaShonda and I were talking about just a moment ago, she had sent some information to someone that, and a client, a buyer, who had was looking at the special assessments. Thank you, LaShonda, for getting that information to her ahead of time. Sometimes you don't have time, I know, to collect these things, but thank goodness, I love this option. In MLS, when you find that that listing, many of the agents are attaching those disclosures and the CCRs and any other, and hopefully some measurements or whatever, they are attaching that to the listing. And I am so thankful for that. So you want to make sure that you ask for it at least, or definitely print it off. And you'll have those in your hand when you start writing your offer. The other thing you're going to have in your hand when you write your offer is going to be your MLS data sheet, of course. And then you want to have a tax data sheet on that particular property. So you, as an agent, sometimes have to verify information. And so the more documents that you have to cross-reference and make sure you have accurate information, the better. So you want to get the disclosures and the CCRs to give to the buyer ahead of time if you can, if not at least at the time they're making the offer. The residential property disclosure, remember, has a 3-day right of rescission in it. So if they don't get that residential property disclosure before they write the offer, they could feasibly get out of the offer, get out of the contract. So you want to make sure that you have those. You also want to make sure, because you want to review them. You want to look through so that you understand. But some of the things that you're going to be making an offer, that you're going to include the offer, might be answered in those disclosures. Now, having said that, you're going to have a whole bunch of paper together when you start writing your offer to purchase, right? The first thing you're going to try to find out is the seller's name. Remember, you're working with the buyer. So how are you going to find out the seller's name? Well, since all of you on mute, I'll tell you. First of all, you look on the tax records. But second of all, you want to look on the residential property disclosure or the mineral oil and gas. You should see the seller's name printed, as well as a signature on those two documents. So what are you going to do? You're going to verify those names with the name that's on the tax records. And if there's a discrepancy, you're going to pick up your phone and call the seller, the listing agent, aren't you? But by and large, it should be the same. If it's an entity, it might be different. And you might have to talk to the listing agent in that regard. But the seller's name will most likely not be in your MLS listing. Most of us have been trained a long time ago not to put the seller's name in even the MLS listing. You're generally going to put W/H for withheld, or write out the wording withheld. That again is to keep people from having too much direct access to the seller. You're going to put the buyer's legal name. Attorneys want you to take that name that's off of the driver's license. They would prefer that you don't write Bubba Smith. Although I guess legally you could possibly get it through, but go ahead and write the legal names here to the degree that you know them. Come down here and get your address. The street address, most of the time, is going to match what is on, again, the residential property disclosure, and it's going to match what is in the MLS. Occasionally, it will be different from the tax rolls because there may have been a change of an address due to the Postal Service. You know, like I live in Matthews and I live on the Mecklenburg side of Matthews. So my zip code is 28105. If I lived on the Union County, it would be 28104, and it would say Matthews, North Carolina, 28104. But I could also live in Weddington or Weddington and some of the other areas, and some of the other little townships in that area, that they would have a 28104, and it might show different in the tax records. So because the Postal Service sometimes changes that, just verify that you're talking about the same property, and the parcel ID is going to be the real key. And where you're going to find your parcel ID is on your tax records, and you're going to come right down here, see where it says PIN, PID. This is where you're going to put that parcel ID. And that's generally a set of numbers in North Carolina. It's generally a set of numbers. Just under there is where you're going to put the legal description. The legal description is going to start with an L. If you come back up here where it says plat reference, we don't use plat references in our area. And sometimes you say, well, I know that L stands for a lot, so I can put the lot number. Yeah, you can, but it's irrelevant because we don't use plat references. I do want you to put the full legal address right here. In the tax records and MLS, you should see the name of the subdivision, which you obviously will list here. If it is a condominium, you should see the word unit in this legal description that starts with an L and generally has a B and an M in it. You should see the word unit. And if you see unit, that denotes that it's a condominium. So you would have a condominium name here. If it's a condominium, it doesn't have any land with the sale. All the land belongs to the condominium association. If it's a townhome, it may be a single family town, not single family, it may be owned individually, or it could be a condominium in the style of a townhome. It may look just like, they're stacked to 2 stories. It may look like a townhome, but it may still be a condominium. So you want to make sure to look on the tax records, and you might even have to look on the deed to find out if it is deeded as a condominium or deeded as a townhome. But that's a little bit more details than you need right now. Come down here to the deed book. You don't put anything by plat book because we don't use plat references. Deed book, you are going to have a deed book, and at page, you're going to see a string of numbers with a hyphen in the middle. You may have 4 or 5 numbers and then a hyphen and 3 or 4 more numbers. The first set of numbers is the book. The second set of numbers is the page. Okay, so when you see that long string of numbers with 1 hyphen, that's the deed book and page, and you definitely do want to put that in there. Now the next section has to do with the purchase price. there's varying opinions on whether or not you start with writing the purchase price in there first and then everything else, or if you come back to the purchase price. That's, you're going to have to know in working with the buyer which is going to be working better. But let's just say we're going to make an offer on this house for, let's say, $300,000. Good luck on finding it today, but let's say we found one and we're going to write it for $300,000. Then we're going to determine how much of a due diligence fee and how much earnest money is going to go with that $300,000 on the sales price, right? Now, something that's new on this particular version that was released in July is this one I've got in blue. The due diligence fee now can be paid by cash, personal check, official bank check, wire transfer, or electronic transfer. That is new. Previous to this, we did not have these options of the official bank check or the wire transfer, electronic transfer. As some of you have probably already experienced, some of these due diligence fees have gotten so excessive you can buy an automobile with them. I mean, I am blown away. I talked to an agent earlier today that the DDF was $40,000. Oh my lands. I did hear we've had 2 or 3 homes that were over $1 million that the DDF was $100,000. Well, obviously, the only way you can do that is through wire transfer. Okay, when you get something that's more than about $4,000 to $5,000, it's going to have to be wire transferred. The wire transfer would not go to the seller. It's going to have to go to the attorney. Do not expect a seller to give you wiring instructions to his personal account when all they have is an offer from you, okay? Or even if it's a contract from your client. But you want to make sure that the closing attorney you're working with would accept the wire transfer and then transfer the money to the buyer upon request. All right. Now that's simple enough. Most attorneys are working with buyers in that way because of the excessive amounts. The electronic transfer is really new. The electronic transfer, as you see right here, it says specify the payment service. This is going to be what, Venmo or Zelle or PayPal. I guess there's some others. Those are the 3 that come to my mind. And if you put that they're going to do a specific electronic transfer right here, look down here. This paragraph is new. If the parties agree that the buyer will pay any fee or deposit described above by electronic transfer, the seller agrees to cooperate in effecting such a transfer, including the establishment of any necessary account and providing any necessary information to the buyer, provided, however, that the buyer shall be responsible for additional cost, if any, associated with such transfer. This is really important that you talk to the listing agent. If your buyer is going to, I have one investor who sends it through PayPal, and he constantly has issues with people who don't have a PayPal account. And he said that's the only way his investor will make an offer. So you have to have that discussion with your listing agent up front, because this contract obligates the seller to set up a PayPal account if that's the way he offers it, and the seller signs it. All right, so you want to have a conversation and make sure that they understand. And if they won't accept it, and in this situation, what we're working with the investor, that's the only way he's going to send money. So it may be that they can't even consider this offer. All right, but that could be a biggie. The other thing you want to take in consideration, if on electronic transfer, they'll only take a limited amount of money per 24 hours. I think it's like maybe 2,000 or 3,000 with one of them and 4,000 with another one. I don't honestly remember the details of them, but you better check with the service before you would put it in the offer here. If they can't take $8,000 and that's what the DDF is, you might have to divide it up into 2 days or go to the wire transfer at the attorney's office. The initial earnest money has the same options of sending the money to the attorney. Remember, our firm does not have a trust account anymore. Most firms are not holding the individual or the firm trust accounts. Most all have gone to attorneys now. So you want to make sure that you have the information on which attorney you're going to use. I think a real good time to talk about the attorney is when you give them those sample forms in the buyer agency agreement. Remember the 3 check boxes. One of the forms, the sample forms you give them, is a professional services disclosure and election form. If you will pull out that sample at that time and start talking to them about, they will be, the buyer is going to be the one that chooses the attorney. And the reason they need to be thinking about that early on is that's where the earnest money is going to have to be taken. And they're going to have to do that within 5 days, because most everybody checks that little box right there within 5 days. They don't give the money with the offer, but within 5 days. So they've got to know not only where to take the money, but in a minute, I'm going to show you where they're going to have to put the name of the firm that they're taking the money to. So you want to start early on talking to them about which attorney they're going to use. You are totally at liberty to recommend 2 or 3 attorneys. You can tell them personal experience that you have found one particular attorney that'd be really, really good. Other agents have recommended others. Do not steer to any one. However, you are at liberty to express your personal opinion, okay? Now, the initial earnest money would be marked as to how it's going to be delivered, and is it going to be delivered within 5 days or with the offer. Most of these other, you are not going to be dealing with on a daily basis, so I'm not going to go to that. But let me point out one thing. We put right here, let's put $300,000 here, and we're going to put $10,000 in due diligence. Generous, aren't I? And we're going to put $20,000 in initial earnest money. So that's $30,000, right? So 300,000 minus 10 minus 20 is going to be down here, simple arithmetic, $270,000. That's all this is. It's a simple arithmetic. It's the purchase price minus what the buyer has already put on the table. And here's the bottom line that's going to be due at closing. It has nothing to do with the loan. A lot of times you get confused thinking it has to do with the down payment and all that. It's not. It's just a simple arithmetic. Now, going on to the next page. Now, this is something, again, it's not in blue. I put it in a different color. This is not new to the contract, but it's something you need to be aware of. If the buyer fails to deliver the due diligence fee or that initial earnest money fee, this is the one time that the seller can terminate the contract. When you go under contract, it's basically the buyer's option going forward, with this one exception. The seller, if they have not gotten the due diligence fee and or the initial earnest money fee timely, then the seller can deliver through the listing agent Form 355, which is a notice to the buyer to deliver cash within 1 business day. If they fail to do that within 1 business day, then the seller would present the Form 352, which is a termination by notice from the seller to the buyer, that the seller is, with that notice, which is unilateral notice, they are terminating the contract. So now the buyer does not have a contract. However, the buyer is not out of the obligation of what he owed in that contract. And so depending on the circumstances and the parties, they still could sue for specific performance, even though they terminated the contract at that time. Just know that's the one time a seller can terminate if the buyer hasn't delivered. Now, also, I wanted to point out, let's see, the other thing I wanted to show you on the due diligence, there are times when a buyer thinks that if they don't pay the due diligence, that nobody can do anything to them. It's like, I've got my money and I'm not going to give it to you. I've changed my mind. I slept on it. Now I don't want that house. They are, again, they are not out of the obligation of the contract. Even if they were to send over a notice that they were going to terminate during the due diligence period, they cannot do it unless they have paid the due diligence. The due diligence fee is for the express purpose of having the right to terminate. And so therefore, if they haven't paid the due diligence, they don't have the right to terminate. And that's when you get into the legal matters of suing for specific performance. And like I told somebody yesterday, I said, anybody can sue for specific performance, but you can't make anybody move out of a house. You can't make anybody buy a house, but you can make them wish they had, because the money it's going to cost them if they haven't. So it's all about money or performance, right? Right here is the line that I told you that you're going to have to put the name of the law firm or the firm. If you're writing it on another firm that does hold trust monies, the listing agent will let you know that. But the buyer can choose, even at that point, to give it to the attorney that's going to be closing. This little paragraph basically is about a disputed earnest money, and I'm not going to spend much time on that today, because if you have that situation, I'm sure you and I'll be talking about it. But by and large, there is a way to resolve disputes. Now, when you look on page 2 of the offer to purchase, there are a lot of definitions. The definition of effective date. There are so many paragraphs in here that have to do with the effective date. Well, you need to know what an effective date is, right? In your mind, but maybe that buyer doesn't know. So they've given a definition or description of an effective date, which is the last date that anybody that was supposed to sign or initial a date has done so. They tell them what due diligence is. You're going to explain it, but here it is in black and white. Same thing with due diligence fee. A due diligence fee, and remember I said, unless they pay the due diligence fee, they don't have the benefit of being in due diligence. And this right here, it kind of explains that. Also note here, and this is new to this contract, see paragraph 23 for a party's right to attorney's fees incurred in collecting the due diligence fee. They've, instead of putting the remedies in each provision and going through the offer, they've now put them all in one provision, and it's number 23. It's right at the end of the contract that says what would be the rights of the person who is seeking a remedy. All right, due diligence period. We have ever since I've been teaching this, and when I was taught it, the form writer suggested 21 days, and you would put the date here. The important thing is not as much the date as it is the time. It's 5 p.m. in North Carolina. It's not, like you hear people say sometimes it's 5 o'clock somewhere. Well, it's 5 o'clock North Carolina, or it don't count. So if your buyer changes their mind, they're not going to purchase the property for whatever reason, they can have the right to terminate that contract as long as the seller has the due diligence fee in hand. They can terminate the contract, but it must be done before 5 p.m. on the end date of the due diligence period. So 5 o'clock on December the 15th, if 5 o'clock passes, the buyer has waived the right to terminate for any or no reason. Before 5 p.m., he can terminate for any or no reason. Most of the time when they terminate, the reason is something to do with his inspections. Occasionally, it's to do with the loan, but most of the time it has to do with inspections or the things that the seller won't fix. So just make sure that when you get close to that day, I wouldn't wait till the afternoon, but that day, whatever the date of the end period is, make sure if the buyer has any reservations of moving forward, they go ahead and sign the form that's called notice of termination by, excuse me, it's called termination contract by notice. They changed the names this year. Termination contract by notice from the buyer to the seller. And there's an option marked for you to mark that is within that due diligence period. And they have the right to do that. But you want to make sure that is ready to go if the buyer has any reservations. I wouldn't send it over until the buyer tells you to pull the trigger, and you might not do that until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Just don't do it after 5 o'clock. All right. Make sure you do it prior. Now, let's say they come to an agreement that day. Sometimes that's the day that they come to an agreement on the repairs. Maybe the seller thought better of the situation and decided they would fix something. Sellers are not doing that too much right now, but let's just say they did, and they came to an agreement. You want to make sure that agreement is signed by both parties prior to 5 p.m. That agreement must be signed by both parties before 5 p.m. or the buyer still would have the right to terminate if he doesn't feel that the seller is going to sign. Okay. The work doesn't have to be done. Just the agreement has to be in place. The settlement, this describes what the settlement is. The settlement in North Carolina is simply going to the attorney's office and signing all that paperwork. That is not closing in North Carolina. That's the date you're going to sign all the papers. The date that you're going to sign all the papers is going to be noted right here. Most of the time it'll be 30 days out, let's say, or 40 days out. Whatever date you put in here, that's the date that you work with the attorney to do all the paperwork. It is not considered closed until you go this paragraph right here. There are 4 steps to closing a property in North Carolina, not even South Carolina. You're going to have settlement. You're going to have one final title review, just in case something snuck in there. So help me, one time we had gotten an IRS lien released in order to close, and they did that final title review, and North Carolina Department of Revenue had snuck in, and so we still had a delay getting that thing closed. But every time I go through this explanation, I think, oh gosh, I remember that North Carolina Department of Revenue sneaking that lien in there. They didn't sneak it in, it was just timing. But that final title review is required. Then there is the release of the funds from the loan company, mortgage company. And then there's a recording of the deed. You've got 4 things that have to take place before that's considered closed. At that time, then you can give the keys from the seller to the buyer. All right. For eons of years, when the buyer sat at that table and signed all those papers and turned over all that money, and the seller signed the papers, the sellers smiled and handed them the keys and the garage door opener. You can't do that anymore. I should say best practice is not to do that anymore. We still see that happen occasionally. If you are going to give keys at the settlement, make sure you have the buyer possession before closing form signed by both parties that allows them to go into the house before they legally own the house. Because see, they don't own the house until it's closed, until the deed is recorded. So keys can be an issue. Just make sure you work it out and cooperate with all parties to get the buyer in there as soon as the buyer needs to be in there. And sometimes the sellers still won't do it. Sometimes the sellers say, no, not until it's closed. So again, it's up to your negotiating skills at that particular time. Okay. The important thing is that the deed be recorded and the ownership transferred, and the insurance is covering the right party in the right way. It's the insurance issue that can be a problem. We had an agent over in I think it was the Greensboro area, whose son bought a house, and would you believe in that interim time the house burned? That's scary, and that doesn't happen. Thank goodness it rarely does, but that time it did, and thank goodness they did have their insurance appropriately designated. So it does happen sometimes. Make sure that you note here that, again, the special assessments. I think I mentioned to you earlier, as LaShonda and I were talking, special assessments has become a real issue this year. Special assessments are no longer called, proposed, and confirmed. We don't use those terms anymore. It's either an assessment or it's not. Okay. An assessment means it's already placed on the property. The seller is already obligated to pay for that assessment, and the seller has to pay for it at closing. The buyer does not assume it. All right. So the special assessment is noted here. There's another place in the duties of the buyer. They need to find out about the assessments. And then there's another place that explains who's going to pay and when they're going to pay. So special assessments has become a real thing in this particular form. Fixtures and exclusions. The fixtures, make sure that you go over the items that are intended to be left with the property, and that's this list right here. Goodness gracious mercy me, look at all these things. Sometimes sellers get confused and they think they own it, so they should be able to take it with them. I hope the listing agent has spent time with that seller to help the seller to understand what needs to stay. My eyes just lit right then on the fireplace insert and gas logs. I well remember many years ago when I sold a house, and the seller took the gas logs, and how angry that buyer was in the final walkthrough. Where are my gas logs? So we had to get the seller to bring the gas logs back from Raleigh. Fortunately, he was just in Raleigh. We've had other situations where stuff has been on the truck to Texas or California, and you can't get them back. Another reason, don't sell a house without a final walkthrough, y'all. Make sure you take your buyer through that one last time to make sure that things are working like they anticipate them working, and make sure the gas logs are there. Make sure the shed is there. This one right here. Oh my lands, the stories I can tell you about storage sheds. According to this contract, a storage shed is intended to stay with the property. It's considered a fixture. You'd be surprised how many people think that storage shed can go with them, especially if it's not on a concrete slab or permanent foundation. They think they could be able to take it. Not. That has nothing to do with it anymore. For years, it had to be on a permanent foundation. Now it just says storage shed, she shed, utility building stays with the property. So you want to talk about a number of those things. One of the things that you don't want to miss is the alarm, the security system. You want to talk to them and find out, but the listing agent, is the seller intending to take his service to a new property, or is the seller wanting to transfer it to the buyer, or is the seller going to pay it off at closing? That is a third-party contract, and it will have to be paid off at closing unless the buyer is willing to pay the transfer fee and assume that service contract. And sometimes it's kind of steep, like $495 for a transfer fee. So help the buyer to understand that there may be a built-in security system built in the house, but the service is not built in, and there could be accessories with the alarm system that wouldn't stay. So clarify that as an agent, okay? Fuel tank, I'm not going to go through some of these because there are some other details that I want to get to today, and there's not enough time. As you can tell, I could probably spend 6 hours just on this one document and still not answer all the questions y'all come up with. Notice this little statement right here: unpairing and deleting data from devices. In our day of smartphones and smart homes, we have all kinds of toys that have interlinking possibilities that a seller could still get into that house or have some access to that house. in some of these tools, the toys, you're going to have to restore the service to the manufacturer's specifications. It needs to be stripped clean, okay? So a garage door opener might be one of those right now. That's going to have to reset. I'm understanding that some of the security companies are putting locks on the front door that they're not removing, and you don't have access to that lock because unless you have service with that particular security service company. So check that out. If there's a Ring doorbell, you want to make sure that the Ring doorbell stays, but the service doesn't stay. So you, as an agent, there's several things for you all to check out on our new tech toys, okay? When you fill this part out, if you understand something about an accessory up to the alarm system wouldn't stay, that it would be noted here if they did want it. This right here is items that do not convey. If it's listed in the MLS that it is an exception, that it doesn't stay, then your buyer still wants it, you have every right to write it in there. I'm not telling you that they're going to get it, but at the same token, they have a right to ask for it. One of the things you do want to be mindful of is this next statement about personal property. Look at this. So this is where it says seller property, personal property. A refrigerator is a personal property. A washer or dryer is a personal property. In MLS, if it's offered with the property, if the seller says in the MLS that there is a washer and dryer and refrigerator that stays, you make sure that you put it in the offer to purchase. Because if you don't, the seller's under no obligation to leave it. They offered it to you. If you don't say, I want it, then they can sell it to the next door neighbor, all right? Or take it with them. So if you want that item that's a personal property, make sure that you note it right here, or they don't have to leave it. And you can't make them bring it back because the agent didn't put it in there. Now this little section of warning, it says buyer is strongly encouraged to conduct due diligence during the due diligence period. If the buyer is not satisfied with the results of the progress of the buyer's due diligence, buyer shall terminate this contract prior to the expiration of the due diligence period, 5 p.m. in North Carolina somewhere, unless the buyer can obtain a written extension from the seller and the seller is not obligated to give an extension. It seems expedient in most circumstances, but there are times that the seller says, I'm not, you didn't get your inspection started, you've dilly-dallied, and I'm not going to give you any more time. There are not under any obligation. So if they're not going to extend it, the buyer's option then becomes either accept it as is or to do the termination. And that's why I say you want to have that termination handy. Now let's talk about the loan. The loan in North Carolina, this little statement here is there is no contingency for loans in North Carolina. The loan is started and hopefully you'll have some indication from your lender that the loan is going to go through before the end of due diligence. But at due diligence at that 5 p.m. date, from that point on, the buyer and the seller share the risk of the loan. So because there's no contingency, all right? This is your property investigation. This is what's done during the due diligence period. Primarily, we think of due diligence period being for the very purpose of inspections. It's really for a lot more than inspections, all right? It's also for the time for them to review documents. This is the time they want to review those CC&Rs. I can't tell you the number of times that they've not reviewed the CC&Rs until either right before closing or even just after closing. One that comes to my mind is an older lady who retired or came down here to live near her children. She left a big house up in the New England or New York area, and she loved the property she got down here. It's one of those pinwheel design, one level ranch style homes, and she loved it because it had a big driveway and it had a big 2-car garage, and she could put all that stuff from that big house up north. She could pack it in there and sort it out after she got down here. Unfortunately, in the CCRs, it says you can't park a car overnight outside the unit. The cars all have to be parked in the garage. You can imagine how upset that little woman was the day before. I'll never forget her. And my poor little agent was just sweating, boy, because she hadn't looked at it either. And so they had to arrange to store her furnishings. Fortunately, hadn't unpacked everything, but they had to had the mover store it until she could sort it out a different way. So there are a lot of things in the CCRs that you need to be aware of as an agent and scan it just as well as the buyer. Ultimately, it's the buyer's responsibility, but I guarantee you, if there's an issue, they're going to come back on you, even though it is their, and it's itemized right here, that it's their responsibility. Another thing is insurance. Make sure they understand that the homeowner's insurance, you have to start homeowners insurance now at least 2 weeks before closing. Don't wait until you get even close to that 2 weeks time to start talking to an insurance agent and finding out what the cost is going to be and the coverage that you want. You don't sell insurance, but you can certainly recommend some people. We have some vendors that are excellent insurance people. So you may want to have a list of some of those people to refer them to. I would suggest don't let somebody buy a house without a survey if you can help it. Why in the world would somebody invest $1 million in property and not even know where the property lines are? Beats me. You know, a survey's going to cost them a few $100s, but so many times people say, well, I'm spending all my money down payment. I don't have the money to get a survey. But if they can, it would be certainly advisable. Talked to a guy just this morning, and someone had he bought a lot and he had checked on the professional service disclosure that the buyer was going to order a survey. Well, he got busy and he just didn't. And guess what? He found out when he did do it after closing that there was an easement that went right through the property, and now he can't build the house that he wants to build on the lot. Had he done what he said he was going to do and he agreed, and now he's just livid at the agent, and it's like, wait a minute, the agent just disclosed everything they needed to do. You made an error, and I'm really sorry, but it is what it is. The other thing, check flood hazards, check utility access, and there's where our little sewer and septic and water agent discovery form comes into play. This is where you're going to find out what the utilities are. Are the utilities connected to the city, county, or is it a well, or is it septic, whatever. Make sure you do your due diligence, and it's also listed, look here, it's listed under the buyer's responsibility. And the thing they added just this year, what I told you a few minutes ago, it is now the buyer's responsibility to check on special assessments. Well, how are they going to check on special assessment without going through you? All right. So, but anyway, they did put it in the list of the buyer's responsibility during due diligence. So, and the fuel tank is that as well. Notice right here, the property is being sold in its current condition. We don't have what's called an as-is contract, but effectively it is, because it's being sold in the condition it is in right now. The seller is under no obligation to fix anything, but it's rare that we don't have the sellers doing something to repair houses. Now, having said that, in the market that we've been in the last 3 months, sellers are not doing too much. But in general, you're going to have this cooperation of the buyer and the seller on some repairs, but the seller is under no obligation. Now, this right here is what I stated to you a while ago about the due diligence fee. The buyer's right to terminate, provided the buyer has delivered and any agreed upon delivery. Well, I can't talk. Provided the buyer has delivered the due diligence fee, then the buyer shall have the right to terminate this contract for any or no reason. You want to make sure they understand that. All right, and you better believe sellers hold them to it also. Now, I mentioned earlier that this contract is not contingent upon any loan. However, they do want us to list what type of loans the buyer is going for, or if the buyer is going cash. And this little paragraph has been redesigned there's two options here. The buyer is going to go cash, which would be a check mark here. And if they are going to go cash, you want to make sure that you have verification of cash so that there would be money ready for settlement. Then if they are going to get a loan, you want to come down here and put the loan information, the type of loan, and occasionally, and I don't think we're going to see this much right now because they've just increased the loan limits. For a while on those jumbo loans, rather than doing a jumbo loan, they were doing first mortgages and second mortgages, and that's why you have two places here for place for loans. And then you have this place down here, other funds. Sometimes it may be that maybe they're getting the money from a hard money lender, or maybe they're getting down payment assistance, or maybe they're going through House Charlotte, maybe they're going through NACA. South Carolina Housing. No, they would be South Carolina Housing. This is North Carolina contract. What is that? It's North Carolina Housing. That's what it is. So it may be that you would need to describe something another way that funds are going to be provided to consummate this transaction. This is strictly for a seller to look at to find out if they feel this buyer is qualified and a strong buyer for their house. It does not mean that if the buyer does not get this loan, that the buyer can get out of the contract. That's the difference in a lot of states. And it's different even with builders contracts here in North Carolina. But with our particular contract, it is not contingent upon it. So, but you do need to identify the type of loan that they're getting. And if they're getting an FHA VA loan, make sure you put the FHA VA addendum with it, because that addendum is going to have to be signed, and it might as well be signed with the offer to purchase. The lender will not finalize the loan without it. And if you don't get it done, the lender will have to get it. Okay. Now, occasionally, and this is new in the contract this year, material changes with respect to funding the purchase of the property that affects the terms of the contract are material facts that must be disclosed. If your buyer starts out with a conventional loan and the lender along the way has decided or advised that they would be better off getting an FHA loan, and they change to an FHA loan, it becomes a material fact that you need to disclose to that seller. The seller needs to sign the FHA addendum in order to proceed. And if you'll remember with the FHA loan, remember when there's an FHA appraisal, if it were to come in low and the buyer chooses not to buy the house, even if he gets up the DDF, if he chooses to, then the seller is stuck with a low appraisal for 4 months for another FHA buyer, remember? But right now, they've just now increased the loan limits on the FHA, which is, I think it was 420, which is dynamite for those who need to buy with the 3.5% down and have the FHA loans. But make sure you remember that these are material facts when they change loan types, and also, or in particular, when it changes the settlement date. That's a material fact, because that is something that obviously is beyond the control of the buyer and the seller. So you want to make sure that you disclose that if that were to happen.
Saber, can I ask you a really quick question about that?
You sure can. Sure.
Thank you. In the event that they do switch over, say they have to go from a conventional, or they, like you said, maybe the lender says it may be more beneficial if you switch over to an FHA loan, and that's a material fact, and they have to let the seller know. Well, what if the seller had listed that they only wanted to deal with maybe cash or conventional at the time?
Mhm.
Would
Well,
they,
but they what they had it listed at doesn't matter because they accepted your contract and now you're negotiating the contract.
okay,
However, they'll probably come back and tell you, hey, we never offered this in the first place. And you said, well, we weren't offering it in the first place either because we didn't know. But now
okay,
it's become expedient for the buyer to be able to go, in order to get this thing closed, we need to go with the new loan.
okay.
Now, I have seen not many times, but I have seen some buyers, sellers refuse to sign it.
Yeah, because
Uh,
I would think that if they didn't want to get, if the appraisal did come in low for whatever reason with the
uh-huh,
FHA, and then they're stuck with that appraisal for the next few months,
uh-huh, uh-huh.
that,
Well, sometimes it's the fact, not so much being stuck with raise. If this buyer can close within, let's say, 10 days, why would the seller go back on the market and risk another 30 or 45 days to
right,
close?
right,
And
makes sense.
that's what you have to point out to them.
Okay,
You know,
thank you.
oh, you're certainly welcome, love. You're certainly welcome. But that could be a doozy. I tell you, we've gone through some of those recently. Now, this next little section here, we do not have a contingency period in our contract, and that includes there's not a contingency to sell that buyer's house in Texas. They're going to buy here, but they got a house to sell in Texas. You want to identify that there's a house to be sold, um, but there's no contingency that they get out of buying this house if that house hasn't sold. There's um, some discussion, let's call it that way. There are some people who feel that it's okay not to disclose that the house in Texas has to be sold because they know that the seller is going to favor an offer that doesn't have a house to be sold, all right? Because it's more of a risk to the seller. And there are some agents who will write this saying there is not a house to be sold. But when it gets right down to it, and particularly at the end of the due diligence period, and the house hasn't sold or something fell through on it, then they're terminating the contract. And it's legal. They can terminate the contract. Of course, the buyer loses their due diligence fee too. But just be aware that you need to be as upfront as you can be. And sometimes it depends on, it's not just you determining that you're going to be fair. It's going to be the buyer. Sometimes the buyer says, I don't want to disclose I have to sell a house because I know it's going to sell in one day, and I know we're going to be able to perform. Well, that may be or maybe not. We've all seen fall throughs too, haven't we? So you do want to have that upfront discussion, and ethically, it seems the right thing to do is to let the seller know that there is a house to be sold, but your buyer does not have a protection as a contingency. Now, and here's where you would put the other address out in Texas. And here it is. You can say it's under contract now, and here's a copy of the contract, and you redact everything except the last name of the buyer and the closing date, so that they know that it can be closed within the time you have on here for the settlement date. You might want to make sure, and the sellers are advised not to consider an offer until they do see that other contract. Let's go down here. The residential property disclosure we talked about already a little bit. We talked about it last week. The residential property disclosure, we want to make sure that if the buyer has received a copy, which you're going to get off of MLS, hopefully, you're going to check yes. If they have not received it, don't check. They're going to, because the listing agent said, I'm going to get it to you. If they haven't gotten it, don't check the have. All right. If you check the haven't and then they get it, you do not have to go back and change this, because you're going to sign and date when you got, or the buyer got it. So that date will supersede this, so you don't have to go back. The mineral, oil, and gas, we're not going to talk about that. That's those disclosures that you're going to have, obviously, or if there's exempt. Remember, we talked about the exemptions to the residential property and the mineral, oil, and gas. Primarily, it's foreclosure in estates. And if it is exempt, write the word in there, as whether it's foreclosure or estate. If it's a foreclosure, a new construction is also exempt. The mineral oil and gas, the new construction is not exempt. There must be a MOG with the new construction. And a family member lived in the house. It's exempted on both of those, all right? But make sure you don't just make a note here of just exempt. It says exempt already. Tell why it's exempt. The buyer's obligation right here would be to check out special assessments. Remember, I've already talked about that a couple of times. Responsibility for special assessment shall take title subject to all special assessments that may be approved the following the settlement. Instead of proposed, they said any assessment following the settlement. This is where it lists the costs that a buyer might incur. The lender is going to give a good loan estimate and the costs that the buyer can expect. So that should be a pretty valid estimate. The buyer's representation, when you look on the MLS, you're going to see the answer to this question here. It is in MLS, whether the seller has owned it for a year or less than a year or doesn't yet own it. There's the lead-based paint. Here's the association dues, what the owners association is about, obviously, and that's going to be in your residential property disclosure. But right here, although it is in the residential property disclosure, it should be, you want to get the information here as well. It's going to be actually in the contract. And be aware that some properties have more than one HOA, particularly in like a mixed development where you have single family and you have condominiums, you have maybe some businesses like Burkdale, Regent Park, Baxter. There are a number of these developments that have mixed use in it, and they're going to have a master HOA for the total community, and then you're going to have some individualized, like the condominium association or the business association. So make sure to know if there's more than one to add both of them in here. Obviously, the seller must give clear title. If they can't give clear title, then the property cannot close. And if the property cannot close because of that, the seller must refund the DDF in addition to the earnest money, and there will be reimbursement costs to the buyer because the seller is the one who is having to breach, or they can't close because of the title. Right here, removal of seller's property. One of the funniest things, and I don't know why I think it's funny, but the agent and I laughed the other night. It was good comic relief for both of us. We had a seller, or it was our seller. And the buyer bought a farm and our agent sold the farm. And would you believe on the final walkthrough, the buyer says, why are those chicken coops still here? I don't want those chicken coops. This is like the day before closing. And in order to close, my agent and her boyfriend took his big old truck and took tools out, and they removed 2 chicken coops off of this farm. And I'm thinking, why would anybody not want a chicken coop on a farm? But she and I just had the biggest laugh. And she said, they didn't tell me in pre-license schools I might have to be moving a chicken coop. But she said they were able to get all that stuff out of there and put it on his truck and took it to the dump. So just those of you who are brand new agents, I don't want to scare you off, but every now and then you have to clean up cobwebs, and you have to do a lot of things that you probably don't even want to do at your own house. But we do what we do to take care of our clients, don't we? But anyway, stuff is supposed to be out of that house. It should be broom swept clean. It doesn't have to be professional clean, but broom swept clean. Okay. This talks about who's going to pay and about the special assessments. We already talked about that. And now I want to go down and show you the rim of this delay in closing. This was something that changed this year. And for years now, we have had an automatic delay in settlement for 14 days. It goes into being, it does not have to be requested. It does not have to be, there's no form that has to be signed. But there were people taking advantage of those 14 days, and I should say abusing the right to have the 14 days. So the form writers now have decreased the 14 down to 7 days, and they have put this little qualifier right here. If it's not possible to close on the settlement date, then you can close within 7 days. That it not possible refers to maybe there's a lien against the property, maybe there's the title issue, maybe the loan's not quite ready. When these were being designed at that time, they were having a hard time getting the deeds down to the courthouse in some counties, not necessarily here, because of the COVID restrictions. But typically, when it says it's not possible, that not possible is from an outside source. It's not because the seller decided they had a cruise booked and they wanted to make sure they got back off the cruise to move. It's not because it's inconvenient because the buyer's child's having a birthday and they can't move that day. If they choose that date as the settlement date, they are responsible to make sure that that's the date is clear, that they can close on that date personally. And like I said, the possibility of not closing normally comes from an outside influence. So that was kind of a pretty stiff change, obviously. And I mentioned to you a while ago about the buyer possession. Every now and then a seller needs to possess a house longer. Maybe their house is not ready, the new house they were going into, and the buyer was gracious enough to stay in the apartment 2 more months. And in that situation, you would have something called a seller possession after closing. But if the buyer wants to go in early, it would be the buyer possession. Okay. Now these are the addendas that you might want to use. The one that I want to call your attention to first here is the one that's called Owners Association Disclosure. Come on, it's not coming down. We mentioned a while ago that there are exemptions to the Residential Property and Owners Association Disclosure. If the property is in foreclosure or an estate, and there is an owners association in that neighborhood, there is a form that just includes the owners association information. Because remember, they're exempt from the residential property disclosure. So there is a form where it's divided out. Years ago, it was divided out and then they put it together. Now they had to divide it out again. Now take a note right here. Real estate brokers are not permitted to draft addenda. Oh, my stomach is still turning. I talked to an agent 5 minutes before I got on this telephone call, and she drafted something that should never have been drafted. And I don't know what's going to happen at closing tomorrow, because it was some serious stuff. Don't do it. Do not do it. Do not do it. Resist the temptation. Okay. Attorneys, you can't practice law without a license. You can't practice law with a real estate license, I should say. So make sure that you can get to an attorney. If you're on a weekend and you can't get to an attorney, put it in an email form that it will be drafted by an attorney as soon as it can be done, let's say on Monday. Let's see, I think we might, oh my goodness, I'm just about out of time here too. It's a good thing I looked at it. This is the new remedies paragraph I talked to you about. If there is a breach by the buyer, then this would be the remedy. If there's a breach by the seller, this would be the remedy. And this is the part they really wanted to add, was the fact that attorney's fees can be recovered and they would be paid by the party who caused the problem, who lost in the lawsuit. So it was decided that they needed to include the general statute that would allow the attorney fees to be paid. And that's why they basically put this in there. Now come on down here. Make a note here that the buyer's failure to timely deliver any fee, deposit, or other payment provided for herein shall not prevent this offer from becoming a binding contract, provided that any such failure shall give seller certain rights to terminate the contract as described herein or otherwise permitted by law. It has become a habit of some listing agents that they will say, well, I'm not putting it in MLS that it's under contract until your buyer delivers the due diligence fee and or the initial earnest money. They can't do that. First of all, it's a violation of MLS rules because it has to go into any status change has to go into MLS within 48 hours. And they can't hold up the terms of the contract otherwise, other than if a seller doesn't have proof of the due diligence and the earnest money, they can prohibit the buyer from coming in and doing inspections. They don't have to allow the appointment until the money is produced, but they cannot hold it out of MLS that it has gone under contract. Okay, and make sure that the buyer understands. On that due diligence fee, we talked about the electronic transfer and the wire transfer. We're seeing more of that right now, but in a different market, we've seen more of the FedEx check for DDF, or even UPS, FedEx, even the Postal Service. As long as you can get a tracking number that the money has been sent, you've got the tracking number so that the seller knows that it is on its way, you are still within compliance of getting it to them on the day. And the DDF is due on the effective date. It is not due 5 days later or 3 days later. It is actually due on that within that 24-hour period of effective date. Okay. Now down here again is your wire fraud warning. You want to point that out, and you see here you might have an entity buyer, or you may be making an offer on a house that has an entity seller. So make sure that you put the correct information here if it is an entity, and who has the legal right to sign for it. Now, remember a while ago I mentioned that I wanted the buyer's information on the buyer agency agreement. I do not want you to put it here. This is where you're going to put, where's buyer notice, says see buyer agent or notify buyer's agent, information below. Same thing here. We have too many assertive, confident people sometimes who want to go around us as agents, and you don't want to make it easy for them. All right. We do not want sellers or listing agents contacting our buyer or vice versa. We don't want our buyer going over here either. All right. So it's best not to have that information here. Just say contact the agent. All right. And again, this is the end. Wait a minute. Let me show you. This is the end of the contract right here. This is the end of the contract between the buyer and the seller. These next 2 pages are information pages. They are not, so you can make changes on here after this becomes a contract. So you're going to have the information for the notices, and then down here. Oh, by the way, if you're the buyer's agent, when you fill this out, go ahead and fill out the information for the listing agent. You can get it off of the MLS sheet. The attorneys are constantly having difficulty getting all the information easily because they don't have that information. They don't have MLS, and so it's so much simpler and then it's helpful to the paralegals. If you are the buyer's agent, go ahead and fill out the information of the listing firm, their firm license number. Again, it's all on MLS. All right. And the information here, not everything, but as much as you know. Now, the last page that we'll go through, if you'll give me about 2 more minutes, this is your receipt page. This is the page where you're going to hopefully get the listing agent and the listing firm to sign that right here they received the due diligence fee. Well, it's been a long time since we've had to take any due diligence fee because they're all going a different way. They're going through with the tracking number, or they're going through wire transfers or electronic transfers. So they're going directly, in most instances, directly to the seller. So you do want to get the seller to sign that they received it. This is a receipt that they have received it. Obviously, if it has a tracking number, you will know it, and you will know if it isn't one of the other transfers. But if the check is delivered, you want to make sure that you get a signature here. And then the important one here is for the attorney to sign this form if they have the form. Many times they're not going to have the form because the buyer is going to deliver the money to them, all right? Or wire the money to them. Send an email requesting the information as to whether or not the earnest money has been delivered for such and such an address. When they reply to you, you can use that email because it's gone directly to the attorney and it's from the attorney's office, all right? You don't have very much right here on additional earnest money right now, so we're not going to discuss that. The only other, I'm not going to go through it, but make sure that you're familiar with the backup addendum. That is such a good addendum. And there are so many people in primary position right now that are falling out for a different reason. They may have won the bid, you know, when they multiple offers. But make sure you talk to your buyer. If they really like that house, a backup addendum is a real good way to for them to have the possibility of getting that house. And then the other addendum that we want to look at is the agreement to amend. If for whatever reason you need to extend a due diligence period, or if you need to, you may, for whatever reason, you might need additional earnest money. All these little provisions are so helpful, and you don't have to practice law. You don't have to write them. All you have to do is check what's applicable here. This agreement to amend is most often used in this little thing right here. Sometimes you have to extend that settlement date beyond those 7 days. And if you're going to extend it beyond the 7 days, it will be an additional 7 days. If you don't mark this little check right here, if you check that, it'll only be an additional 4 days. But if you make an amendment and you change this date, whatever date this is, per the contract, there is an additional 7 days. But you can check this and cut that second 7 days down to 4 days. That helps you a little bit. Reason you need 4 days is with the TRID rules, you know, the buyer has the right to have that information about the final numbers for at least 3 days. And so you give that 4th day for the lender to get that out. That's why you really can't do much less than 4 days. So that's why you want to have that. And the home warranty right here, the home warranty could be part of the contract. And if it's already part of the contract, you want to make sure that you note it on here. And the other form, again, is our sewer thing. I didn't get a chance to go through this, but we're way past time, and I've kept you all longer than I meant to. But make sure you are real comfortable with this services, the professional services disclosure. That saves your bacon, guys. This is your best risk management form, so make sure you're familiar with it. Gosh, it's been good to be with y'all today, and thank you so much for joining us. And you got my phone number and you got my email, so let me know if I can help you in any way. And again, thanks for being with me. I hope y'all have a Merry Christmas.
Thank you. You too, Sabra. And if you don't mind, can I get a copy of this recording whenever you have a chance?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Let me, wait a minute. Was that LaShonda?
It was. Thank
Okay.
you. I appreciate it. And Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you. And I'll send it out to you now, dear.
Thank you.
Thank you. Merry
Bye,
Christmas.
y'all. Bye, y'all.